Hello and welcome to Exploring Global Problems, a podcast where we talk to academics from Swansea University whose groundbreaking research is tackling global challenges, from health innovation to sustainable futures in the environment, from digital technologies to clean energy. My name is Sam Blaxland, and today I'm joined by Karen Morrow, Professor of Environmental Law, and Dr. Victoria Jenkins, Associate Professor in Environmental Law, both here at Swansea. Karen's research focuses on public participation in international environmental law and policymaking, and Victoria explores the connections between law, policy and governance in the environmental context, especially in relation to local and Welsh issues. Karen and Victoria, welcome to Exploring Global Problems.
Thank you very much.
So to kick us off, could you both tell us what your research is about, just kind of in a nutshell? So Karen, to start with.
Okay, I look at various dimensions of involving people in environmental decisions. There tends to be a perception that a lot of environmental issues are very technical, very scientific, very political, but all environmental problems are ultimately people problems in one way or another, and at different levels of governance, and Victoria will speak to the local and Welsh dimensions. There are distinctive challenges in getting people's voices into the room. So I look at that particularly in the context of global climate change issues and to a lesser extent sustainability thinking.
Great, lots to unpack there, which we'll do in a moment. Victoria.
So I started out looking at sustainable development and legal approaches to sustainable development, but more recently I've focused on sustainable land management and landscape. And so I'm interested in how we take these sort of complex concepts and then bring them into law and how law can respond to those challenges. And my work, as you said, it focuses on the local level. So I've always been interested in local government and the responses there, and then also Welsh government. So since devolution, I've been particularly interested in being in Wales in the way that the Welsh government responds to these sorts of issues.
Great. So something from the outset there, which I'm thinking about, is we've got global and then more local. So just sort of addressing that for a second, how do those two different approaches differ, and how would you say, sort of looking at each other's work, how obviously there's loads of synergies and overlaps here, but what are your slightly different approaches to all of this?
Okay, there is a horrible neologism that's used to describe environmental issues, glocal. And I don't like it on a linguistic level, but actually in a descriptive level, it's perfect because there is a context here. It's very rare in legal contexts for what's international, what's regional, what's national, what's subnational, what's local, to actually sort of fit into any sort of coherent whole. But in environmental law, there's more of an argument for that than in most areas. And it's such a huge range of activities that we're talking about here that's absolutely impossible to deal with everything. So one of the things I really love about working with Victoria is that we have quite different knowledge, but a similar sort of perspective that locks together in many ways.
Yeah, so my work is really about, although I'm looking at what happens locally and what happens in a Welsh context, ultimately those things are connected to what has been agreed at an international level. So, we have global agreements, as I'm sure most people are aware, on climate change and biodiversity. So what I'm looking at is how that translates at these more local and regional levels within the country. And obviously then I also would take into account what happens at the UK level and beyond. But, it's about how you take this and translate it into action on the ground. And my more recent work has been with peat scientists looking at peat protection. And so that's also connecting then to what practically happens on the ground and what are the influences on the work that's happening in terms of conservation.
I suppose the concept with this Glocal thing, which is a new one for me, I'm always learning, is that, with something even just like, say, air quality or whatever, it's there aren't boundaries and borders, are there? So things can happen across kind of borders. So actually what can be a local concern can be sort of a globalized local thing. I suppose is that sort of getting to the heart of one of the issues here?
Yeah, the environment doesn't really understand borders. Borders are a nice convenient human construct, but pollution in Swansea contributes to pollution in Wales, contributes to pollution in Ireland, depending on prevailing winds.
Sure.
Feeds into a global, European and global context. So very literally, they dovetail.
The land management issue and the peat stuff that you were talking about a minute ago there, Victoria. Can you say a bit more about that?
So recently I've been involved in a project which is looking at sustainable peat management at the local level. So what could be the role of local authorities in trying to support peatland management. So the Welsh Government has significant targets on sustainable peat management and in particular peat restoration. And the question is how we're going to meet those targets. At the moment, a lot of emphasis is on what's happening from a national perspective. So our Environment Agency for Wales is called Natural Resources Wales. So the focus is on what they can do in terms of restoring peat. But my project has been looking at, as I say, what we could do much more locally in this respect. So peatland management is really important because peatlands can deliver multiple what we would call ecosystem benefits. So they can contribute in terms of climate change by, sustainable peatland management can ensure that the carbon that's contained within peat is maintained. So, for example, if there's a wildfire on a peatland, it will release a huge amount of carbon. So that's a really big problem. Also, if we restore or maintain those peatlands, we can contribute to flood prevention because they are very significant wetlands. And those are the things that, law and policy tends to focus on, but they can also be really significant in terms of ecosystems resilience. So they don't support necessarily a huge and diverse range of different species, which is what we would want in terms of biodiversity, but they do support a small number of significant species. And like I say, they're really significant in terms of ecosystems resilience. And then there are the cultural benefits as well. So recreation and just the fact that peatlands, in particularly in Wales, are a really significant part of our landscape.
Well, I was just going to ask about that. Where are some of these peatlands, either locally or where are some of the big ones in the UK?
So peatlands cover about 4% of Wales. My research focuses on Wales. So they cover about 4% of the land in Wales. Mostly we find them in the uplands, but obviously most of Wales is uplands. So there's significant areas there. But there are also some very significant smaller areas of lowland peatland in Wales, which you would find often are protected through our legal systems. And so you might sort of colloquially call them nature reserves. Oh. So there's a very significant one next to the university, actually. There's a significant peatland there that's called Crumlin Bog that's actually a protected area.
Great.
Can I just chip in there, actually, because this is an area where our work actually just turns out to overlap. I'm currently acting as Deputy Chair of the Welsh NetZero advisory group, which is formed part of the under the agreement between Plaid Cymru and the Welsh Government to provide expert independent advice on how to get to net zero. And just this week, we'd been having a meeting where we were talking about the Climate Change Committee's 2023 report on progress in Wales thus far. And one of the areas where the independent advice there was pointing to the need for Wales to do more in an area that is within Welsh competence is peatlands. So we were actually just discussing that earlier today. It's something that has huge local significance, but actually feeds into what we're doing as a nation in Wales, how that's contributing to what the UK is doing globally as well.
We've talked about this a little bit on the podcast before, and I've always put sort of a devil's advocate position to certain guests, and we've talked about things like net zero and climate change, and said when some of the main players on the global stage, your China's, for example, but to an extent the USA as well, are not committed to nearly as kind of stringent net zero targets as we are. Is what Wales does, even is what the UK does, making any difference at all?
Yes. In short terms. Now, first of all, China is a very different kettle of fish from the US in terms of what it's doing. But the most interesting activities in fighting climate change on a global basis aren't actually happening at the international law level at all. It's mostly at city level, small nation level, state level. And there's a tremendous cooperation globally between those subnational tiers of government that is very creative, shares good practice, and is actually making a difference in real terms. So one of the things with the international climate change regime is it can be very, very depressing to deal with for obvious reasons. It moves very slowly. It gets trying to achieve agreement is incredibly difficult. And that often masks the very good work that's actually being done on the ground. And it brings us back to the idea that what's happening on the ground may not often get the headlines, but that's where the differences are actually happening.
And you think there are tangible differences that are going to be made here? I mean, I'm just thinking if there's not, if I don't know, for example, China is continually opening loads of coal-fired power stations, then is what happens on city level in smaller countries going to really make a difference to the big picture?
Everything makes a difference. And at this point, we have run out of options for pointing the finger and saying it's somebody else's problem to deal with. China is improving on a number of fronts. One of the most interesting things people might not be aware about China is that they actually have made environmental law a mandatory part of the law degree in China about 5 years ago now. And you can actually see that's actually changing, certainly academic work coming out of China, and changing the willingness of Chinese academics to network and to publish outside of China. So it's actually something that sounds very abstract and very academic is actually making a difference to that interfacing with the rest of the world
very
on
interesting.
this.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose a cynic would say it could be just all talk and no action, potentially.
You could, but looking at what China is actually doing, the scale of what China is doing means the coal looks terrible. That will anywhere. But so much hydro and other things as well, lots of work on renewables too. So the picture is a lot more complex than the headlines maybe convey.
Yeah, as always. Sticking with you for a minute, Karen, your work focuses on gender as well, doesn't it? Now, obviously, we might not necessarily think of there being a direct link between what we're talking about and gender, but obviously for you there is.
Yes, I work in an area known as Eco-feminism, and Eco-feminism, as you might guess from the name, brings together ecology and feminism. And what it points to is the idea that very exploitative approaches to our world, to treating nature as a resource to be used, spat out and disposed of, is also an approach that extends to people and people not in power, including women. Women are very underrepresented in law, politics and policy at all levels, all over the world. People who are not in power are often on the receiving end of a lot of the adverse impacts that treating the environment badly creates. So there's a big overlap there. And it's not just women who are excluded, people of colour, people with disabilities, the elderly, the young. Basically, if you're not part of the in club, you don't really have a voice in terms of how things are being done. It's not just about our politics, it's about our business and industry as well, which is male-dominated and male-led. It's about science. Again, male-dominated and male-led. Great example there, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change only realised, or recognised rather, that it had a gender problem in 2018, which is quite shocking. You know, this shouldn't be news. Women's rights have been an issue since in the UN since its inception, so, 70 odd years ago. So it's something that seems to need to be rediscovered or discovered anew in every context. And those voices, those people who are shaping the science, who are shaping the industry, who are shaping the politics, do it in their own image. And they do it very often with the best of intentions, not always, but often with the best of intentions without realising that that is what they're doing. But without that level of reflection and without bringing those other voices into the room, you end up with a system that just works in its own interests and perpetuates what we've always done. What we've always done has brought us to a pretty worrying situation. We need to do things differently.
And this ecofeminism label term, I guess, is this something that you're keen to actually promote as a term and as an idea?
It's a really interesting term because it initially was greeted with great enthusiasm, but was very quickly criticised for a lot of reasons, for being too white, being too Western, being essentialist, meaning that some very early ecofeminists tended to think, it's a matter of biology that made women closer to nature.
Oh, interesting.
But that's actually not where most ecofeminism is now. Most ecofeminism now is social ecofeminism. So it's actually based on the idea that it's not your biological sex that determines your relationship to the environment or to anything else. It's where you're placed in society, it's power structures, it's the ability to have a say in governance and government.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking about that. I guess for some people who might need to be convinced of certain elements of environmental policy. They might see, I don't know, the environmental stuff as a bit, I guess, to put it bluntly, as left-wing, and then they also think of like feminism as also like a left-wing cause, and then the coupling of those together might not be unhelpful in bringing other people on board. I don't know what you think about that. Outside of academia, I think, yes, particularly we're talking
if you think equality is left-wing, although actually...
Well, some people probably do, yeah.
Yeah, but actually equality is a foundational value in all value systems, regardless of political orientation. Probably the thing that makes ecofeminism most interesting and most useful, and actually does draw people in, I think, is the fact that it combines theory and activism. So it's not all just about people like me sitting writing abstruse volumes of critical theory. It's actually, it has always worked with activists and activism, and bringing those ideas of this thinking about how you treat people, how you treat the environment, how inequalities and problems tend to overlap and tend to work in concert with each other to aggravate problems, but actually then looking at solutions, particularly grassroots solutions, to make that better.
Have you got some thoughts on this, Victoria?
Yeah, it does connect very much with what I look at, which is in terms of local sort of policy and governance and the delivery of ecosystem benefits to local communities. Often, as Karen said, those benefits are not equally distributed. And so there can be, different impacts on different communities. And I'm particularly interested in the way that those benefits are felt by disadvantaged communities, which is a particular issue, perhaps in Wales in some places,
Yeah, because when you say disadvantaged communities, what are you thinking of in particular?
So I'm thinking about those communities who would be considered to be disadvantaged according to the multiple index of deprivation. But also my work looks at the way that those communities can also benefit from their natural and cultural heritage in a way that perhaps we don't actually consider sufficiently in law, policy and governance, so that what we consider to be a disadvantaged community, maybe we need to reconsider in relation to issues around the natural environment.
Yeah. We started this discussion by talking about this being a people problem, and I think that's very intriguing and a very interesting way of approaching this. Should we say more about that, Victoria, about this kind of very people-focused approach?
Yeah, I think it's really important, the connections between people and nature, because ultimately people will only want to protect those things that they consider to be important to them. And I think this has come really very much to the fore after the COVID-19 epidemic, because as we know, that was the point at which a lot of people started to connect with nature, and also to connect with nature on their doorstep rather than thinking perhaps about global problems. And it then helps them to make the connections between those local and global issues, that, the connections that we've been talking about. So I think it's vital, really, this relationship between people and environment. You can't adopt, just as Karen said, technical solutions to these problems, or I don't believe that you can. You have to take communities with you. They have to understand the significance of the work that you're doing. And ultimately, the work that I do in terms of look at in terms of sustainable land management focuses very much on changing landscapes. And if you're going to, introduce interventions that are going to change those landscapes that people value for cultural reasons, for example, then you need to take those communities with you. They need to understand why you're doing it and what impact it's having and what benefit it's having to them. So yeah, absolutely, it's really, really important.
I think this leads me on to something I'll pose to both of you, which again we've spoken with other guests about, and it does relate to what you said, I think, Victoria, which is that it's a very different kettle of fish, isn't it? Say, talking to someone about the air quality in their local town, or about perhaps a row of trees on their street that they like and maybe might get cut down, versus very big, what might seem to some people quite abstract, sort of unfathomable things about climate change or whatever. So how do you approach that and address that sort of almost micro, macro situations?
Well, that's where social scientists and lawyers, etc., have a role to play. Climate change started off as very technical. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's work in its initial phases was almost entirely hard science-based. Now that's changed, and right from the very highest level, this idea that psychology, communication, narratives even, telling the stories of climate change are actually really important for bringing people with you. For something like air pollution, it's a great example of actually something that has really dire impacts on people's everyday life, but actually feeds directly in to climate change. So if you can make those stories relevant to people and you can show that their experience is part of that bigger whole, it makes it much easier to identify with these broader narratives, I think.
Yeah, and I guess this is an argument for what everyone in academia does talk about, isn't it? Which is getting out of your silo, doing interdisciplinary work, working with colleagues, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And the work that I do, like I say, I've been working with peat scientists because I need to understand, I didn't understand a year or two ago anything about what peat was or why it might be interesting to people, what benefits it might bring to people. So to understand that, you really need to work with scientists and to understand what we need to do to ensure sustainable peatland management for the future. So once you can understand that, then you can bring your legal knowledge to play to say, okay, so does the law support that? Is the law actually creating a framework connecting with policy? Because obviously the two can't really be distinguished. And so are law and policy really creating a framework that's going to support that into the future? What do we need to see? This is a really, like I say, like all of the issues that we look at, they're really complex issues. And we need to have a really good understanding of them before we can move forward. So I think interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research is really, really important. And I think that's the way that research is moving these days.
I mean, in some ways for us, it's the natural norm in environmental law, because environmental law is entirely related to science, but also increasingly to social science, even to the arts. All of these things are interconnected, and the problems that we face with the UN calls it the triple environmental crisis, are such that we need to bring all of our agency as humans, all of our talent, all of our understanding together and try to make these things work as mutually reinforcing rather than separating. And one of the things we've both worked at, I think, in our career very hard is scientific literacy, and that doesn't come naturally to you if you've come from a legal educational background. I think we've both educated ourselves in our various areas. I would not claim to be a climate scientist, but I understand the basics.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because typically people doing law or people like doing arts and humanities like me, we're a world away from scientific jargon and understanding. But you've actually delved into some of the literature in that area. Yes,
and I actually teach it as well. Right. I actually start my environmental law modules off with looking at a scientific paper on planetary boundaries theory. Planetary boundaries theory is very cutting edge about climate change, biodiversity, the phosphate cycle for fertilizers, water cycle, etc. It's looking at all the things we need to be within safe limits for us to flourish as a society globally. And the students find it very challenging. But we do it at a fairly basic level, and it's to break down that conceptual barrier that you just look at the law books and that's all you need to actually think about in this area. So, we'll look at it and I'll actually ask them to come in and say, right, well, of the 9 planetary boundaries, what are your top 3? Why? And that actually takes it from being something very abstract to something that, as lawyers, that's the sort of information digestion that we do all the time, prioritising, cutting down arguments to their basics, etc. And then getting them to make a case for their arguments. It works really, really well.
And it's not just science either, So I look at landscape and law. So to understand the relationships between landscape and law, you actually have to understand landscape, which is a lot of it is cultural geography. So it's not just science that we connect with, like you say, it is social science as well.
Yeah. You brought some props, some things with you. So do you want to tell us what they are?
So this is my mug with a peatland on the front of it from Peatland Conference, because most of my research is about peat. And then this is a little Welsh dragon, because my research focuses on Welsh devolution. And it also reminds me that not only am I an academic, I'm a mother of 3 children. So I brought that with me.
Has the dragon got a name?
No, he's just a Ddraigwch.
That's right. He looks like he's been around quite a lot as well. He looks kind of
He has been around for a very long time.
Very nice. What have we got here?
Right. This is an example of craftivism.
Ah.
An academic from the University of Reading a few years ago came up with what's become a very famous image now, the climate stripes. And various craft groups worldwide have knitted the climate stripes. This is a century of global temperatures. And you will note the present is very dark red.
Do you want to give me one end?
Yeah. The past is much bluer, where the temperatures were much lower. So you can really graphically see how global temperatures have improved, or not improved, have changed over year.
I'm on the warm end.
Hot stuff.
I think blokes do run hotter as well, so that's kind of quite appropriate, isn't it? Cool. Thank you for bringing them in. Now, I know that you've both spoken about doomism narratives. What does that mean?
Bunny in the headlights. Climate change is with us already. It's too late to stop it. That is a very worrying thing to know and to take on board and to really understand. But, and the but is really important here, that doesn't make what we do insignificant. In fact, that makes everything we do significant. Everything counts. So doomism is this idea, there's no point in doing anything about it. Climate change is with us already. We're all doomed. It's all going to happen. Yes, climate change is with us already, but we have a lot to offer in terms of ameliorating the adverse impacts of climate change. So it can be a lot less bad than a doom accepting perspective would make it.
And law develops very slowly, doesn't it? So, we have to be thinking now about the mechanisms that we're going to need to adapt to climate change. So, we are starting to look at climate change mitigation and what we can do in terms of flood prevention and wildfire prevention, etc. So, and law academics have been doing that for quite some time now. So it's anticipating the problems that are going to arise.
Yeah. I was going to ask this because I know you're not hard and fast scientists, even if you're dabbling in lots of it. But the language is often, isn't it, about battling climate change and fighting it and all this kind of stuff. But what about a more nuanced perspective, which says, like you say, adapting to it, or even actually using emerging technologies to actually mitigate things as they happen? Is there a subtler approach here, or are you still both actually on the side of no, this is very serious and we need to be pushing back almost?
The battling analogy, we use it a lot in society. It's a very male analogy, I would say, as a gender scholar.
Oh dear, that's right. and I brought it up. There we go.
But it's the sort of language that male politicians use to mobilise the population. It's also the sort of thing we use in medicine. One of my pet hates is battling cancer.
Yes,
no, you have cancer. Yeah. You're not somehow cooperating with it if you don't recover. So I don't think it is the most positive way of putting it. In eco-feminist thought, the idea of the ethics of care is my preferred way of looking at it, which is a relational ethic in how we deal with each other as humans and how we deal with the environment around us. And the idea being that we care for vulnerable humans, not because they can do anything for us, but because they deserve care. Not quite the same with the environment. Yes, there are vulnerable environments that we do need to care for, but ultimately the vulnerability there is much more interesting and nuanced because we are also vulnerable to an environment that we don't care for. But there's a different way of looking at it that is more relational. That is a really good way of putting it. How do we relate to the environment? How does that affect how we relate to each other? So that's how I would look at it. But Tori, you may have a different view.
No, I don't think so. I think, I would agree with that. It's not something that I sort of look at significantly in my work, but I would say that was a much more healthy approach to it.
Now, work like the stuff that you do obviously involves lots of collaboration and working not just within the academic sector, although I'm sure you do with other colleagues and other institutions, but also with bigger organisations, NGOs, government. And for you, Victoria, I believe it's the Welsh government in quite a lot of scenarios, isn't it? We have spoken about this. So do you want to say a little bit more about the actual process of collaborating and working with these other groups?
Yeah, so I think in the last few years in particular, I have engaged more with organisations from outside the university, and I find it really helpful in the sense that it really helps to inform the research that you do and helps to ensure, the greater quality to what you're producing, because you are recognising problems that exist actually exist out there, and you can think about your responses to them. It's also very challenging because ultimately you are an academic, so our role is not just to think about what can be achieved within current governance systems, but what might be achieved. That sort of blue sky sort of thinking that perhaps those organisations themselves aren't always involved in. And also it's, we operate very differently as organisations over different timescales, particularly if you are doing something that involves government. Their timescales are very short in comparison to academic timescales. So that can be very challenging. But like I say, it's really, I think overall, it's very, very important to do this, to get out there and to speak to people who are actually involved in, either they are part of government or they're lobbying government, or they're working with government, because ultimately we're all working towards the same objective in terms of trying to achieve greater environmental protection in Wales. So yeah, those are the organisations that I would connect with.
And obviously, there's loads of opportunities in there, but I'm getting a sense that there are big frustrations as well, and that timeline issue is obviously a thing.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think anybody who's been involved in doing any of this kind of work will say that, because as an academic, you want to make sure that everything that you're doing is very much grounded in research that you have confidence in, and you want to check out every single possibility. You want to make sure that you've looked at every single angle, and this takes an awful long time. And yet, if your work is going to have an impact in terms of policy making, those policies are developed over a much shorter timescale. So you have to adapt really to that, and it can, like I say, it can be really very difficult. It's also a different way of writing, because obviously you write documents for these audiences, and they're very different audiences, and so I have to resist the temptation to put hundreds of references in work because it just wouldn't make sense then to that audience. So you have to adapt to that, and actually each of those audiences is quite different. So if you're writing something that is for non-governmental organisations, that might look very different to something that you were writing for government, and that's a real challenge as well.
What about you, Karen?
I do a little bit of this sort of thing. So I was on the Hinckley advisory group. So that's a very cross-disciplinary group with fishery scientists, nuclear scientists, public health Wales, and various other actors involved in it. And
this is in relation to the Hinkley Point nuclear power station.
And that was a really interesting process, because I joined that group quite late in the day and was then sort of providing legal prescriptions for the various problems that had been raised. And there is a real challenge in explaining what law can and can't do, even to other professionals, because our perspective on it is quite different. And I think helpful. It's challenging to do, but it makes it very, very interesting.
And without really drilling down here, I mean, what kind of stuff or what kind of advice or discussions are you having in these groups? Just give me a working example of what you do there.
Hinckley's a great example. One of the problems there is post-devolution communication between the Welsh and the English sides of the border, which can mean that decisions are being made by English authorities that don't necessarily take into account Welsh law, and Welsh environmental law is now quite different from English environmental law. So there, because I came to environmental law through public law, I was able to look at administrative law and the concept of a memorandum of understanding. And what a memorandum of understanding is a sort of almost like a contractual agreement between, say, Natural Resources Wales and the Environment Agency in England, now that they're separate, that actually lays out a particular area where they need to work across the border and sets out in a publicly available document the terms of engagement. And those needed to be updated post devolution, hadn't really been. So Hinckley provided us with an opportunity to actually feed that in. So that was one of the things we recommended that actually was acted on.
Interesting. In both your cases, you're obviously working on topics that matter a lot to you, but you recognise that there are big societal global even implications to what you're doing. How much or to what extent does that have an impact on you personally and on your lives when you leave the office?
Well, I do try as far as possible to, to live the life that I am promoting, in the sense that, to be, to adapt the way, that I shop, the way that I live, to make simple changes for environmental protection. So there's a lot of information out there about how you can take shorter showers to use less water, how you can have a water butt in the garden, just simple things like this. And, buy less clothes, don't throw things away until they're actually broken or need to be replaced. I think buying less is probably one of the strongest messages in terms of environmental protection. So, I do try as far as possible to adopt that in terms of my own lifestyle, but also I do try to ensure that my children would also follow, that approach. It's more difficult to to get them to buy less things, but yeah, definitely, I think.
Same. Climate grief is a real thing, and actually it's mentally wearing and difficult to work on in these areas, and can be very, very discouraging. So the way you live your life is the one thing you do control. And it's things like, I've been teaching myself Japanese boro embroidery to repair my jeans, because I like crafts. So a bit of craftivism. I read cli-fi for fun. And I've also got a stonking end of the world playlist with every environmental disaster you can think of, including a string quartet version of the Kyoto Protocol to the Framework Convention on Climate Change on it, because you've got to laugh.
Do either of you fly? As in, not literally as the pilots. Sorry, but do you get on planes?
Yes. More than I would like to. I offset. I've cut down my travel, particularly I used the pandemic as an excuse to do that. And actually one of the things that I really enjoyed about the pandemic was being able to do things like keynote conferences in Spain, where I had people from 5 continents in my sessions. People are now trying to ratchet up the travel again, understandably, because it's not the same doing it online, and that network building needs to be done. So offsetting is very important. Finding credible offsetting is very important. Trying not to travel when you can avoid it, or fly when you can avoid it. But for me, I have to fly to see family. Otherwise, it takes me 2 days each way. So, it's a really difficult one. There are compromises to be made. But then again, I don't drive. I use public transport. I shop locally. So one of the things I actually, get my students to do to bring home the personal side of it, I get everybody to do a carbon footprint test and come in with their findings on it in terms of where we fit in. And, we talk about things like travel, personal travel. I don't fly for holidays anymore, for example, other than to see family once every 2 years, because I've cut that down. And that's really thought-provoking. But that started to make me think, when I started doing it, about the need to make sure that I'm making the best choices I can make.
I don't like flying, so it makes it quite easy to avoid flying. But I have been on a plane, and I will go on a plane mostly and when I think back, it has been for work trips. I haven't flown to go on holiday for a number of years. But yeah, it does make it easier when you don't like flying. So.
One of the problems of being an international environmental lawyer is a lot of the things I do require it. But,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I just wonder if there's a. I assumed you both would say that you have either cut down on it or don't. But is there a tension here with academic types, I suppose, saying basically that people should think about not going, I don't know, to their Spanish summer holiday every year? People who probably save up for it and don't have a huge amount of pleasure in life, and that is one of the things they really enjoy doing. I sense sometimes there are tensions here in this topic, aren't there?
There are, and nobody's living a perfect life. It's making the most positive choices you can. And, I do not drive. I don't own a car. I've never owned a car, but I made that as a deliberate decision as one thing I could do. It makes my life very inconvenient. The commute can be hell, particularly with strikes, broken trains, etc., etc. But exactly, I know I speak of a pain many people know, but it's a deliberate choice. But it's one that actually, even in the context of working in the university, takes a lot of working around. Public transport in South Wales is not great. It's something I feel quite strongly about in terms of, again, gender, most of the people you see on public transport, certainly on buses in and around Swansea, if you look, are women. Lots of students, so it creates a really negative impression in terms of our TripAdvisor reviews, apparently, and working class people. And public transport in the UK is expensive, proportionate to what you get, and it's inconvenient. It needs to be a lot better on all scores.
Yeah, I think there's a huge philosophical discussion to have about all of that, isn't there? But
the perfect is the enemy of the good is the line here. You do what you can.
Yeah, I suppose.
It's different for all of us, I suppose.
If you've got young people listening to this who are interested in this topic and they want to get specifically into your lines of work, into the kind of, I guess, the environmental law side of things, what advice would you give them? Karen, do you want to go first? Well
informed. In terms of looking to good media sources, etc., to see where the issues are. That's where you choose your motivation for how you're going to specialise. Take every opportunity you have and you are given to use your voice, because not everybody has it. Protest if you feel the need to protest. That is a basic human right and not one that's faring well in the UK at the minute. And know that what you do counts. So what you choose to study, if you've got options in environmental law, in nature conservation, in human rights, in ethics, these are important things to actually tool yourself up to take your career and use it to make a difference, and you can.
Yeah, I'm often asked by law students, how to get into environmental law, and I say the same thing. You really need to take an interest in the subject. You need to go out there and do some voluntary work with one of these charitable organisations that are working for environmental protection, understand the problems, understand the issues, and that can be a good foundation then for moving on and getting into this area of work. And, if you are offered the opportunity to study some form of environmental law, then that's, a really good idea as well. But if that's not a possibility, then you can go away and you can find out these things for yourself, as you said.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
If you want to find out more about Karen and Victoria's research, you can visit their staff profile pages on Swansea University's website. To find out more about this podcast and Swansea University's research, visit swansea.ac.uk/research. That's all from us today. Thanks for listening, and thank you once again to my guests, Professor Karen Morrow and Dr. Victoria Jenkins. If you've enjoyed this episode, please follow us. I'm Sam Blaxland, and that was Exploring Global Problems from Swansea University.